It has been 4 months since Hi-Rez began open alpha testing on Smite 2. The initial patch proved a promising look at the IP's future, but with each subsequent update, became increasingly more difficult to form a coherent picture of where the game was heading. I've come to associate this with 3 central issues that arose from development. The first being old versus new. How much change was permissible to Smite 1's formula in order to increase new player accounts without chasing away the old guard? Next is balance versus fun. How can Smite 2 stay stable and approachable while still providing thrilling moment-to-moment action? Lastly, fast versus slow. How does the development team meet their deadline for the project, but not rush it out of the oven before it's fully cooked? And while I can't say these have been addressed in full, for the time being they don't need to. After all, the game is only in an alpha state. The steps Hi-Rez has taken to address them, however, hasn't gone unnoticed. In regards to development time, the schedule was pushed back to allow time for more intimate testing, with the 24/7 alpha initially slated to be released back in July. Whereas the community feedback over the last few months about time to kill in Smite 1 was proactively implemented into 2. And the elements of Smite that felt paramount to the game's identity, but were missing in its sequel have returned, many of which I'll touch upon shortly. So where does the game's current state leave me, a veteran of the game with closer to 4,000 hours invested into it, feeling? I'd be lying if I said I was the most optimistic I've been about it. After all, I was bouncing off the walls when it was originally announced. However, the 24/7 release took the promise shown during Alpha Weekend 1, scaled it back to Smite 1, and has landed in a fairly stable spot. Here are the changes I've come to appreciate the most. After the initial decision to downsize relic options to only allow for wards and beads, the team has gradually built back up the selection to include Blink, Aegis, Shell, and Sunder. Although they feel like a shadow of their former selves due to the upgrades being removed, being limited to 1 per match, and overall cooldown changes, the absence of choice was greatly perceived. As I made mention in my first video, if beads were universal, the ones who likely benefit from this would be tanks, as any trading cooldown would inherently be in their favor. Now that tools have been diversified, a tank is more likely to choose Blink, Shell, or Sunder, making the trades less lateral. That being said, with beads being a 210 second cooldown, and Shell or Sunder being 130 and 110 respectively, there could be concerns that arise down the line. Or it might just make Aegis with its 140 second timer seem all the more appealing. Initially, it was possible for a god to deal either physical damage, magical damage, or both. This was unlike Smite 1 where a god was classified as dealing one or the other. This in conjunction with the newly added strength and int stats made for a noticeable amount of confusion amongst the player base. An ability that scaled off int but did physical damage was a little hard to digest. More importantly, defensive counter building felt less intuitive. If all 5 enemies had mixed kits, it would require full awareness of which character, which ability, and which damage type was hurting you if you wanted to build defense against it. And in a game where there's 23 different characters with 4 or more abilities each, and over 100 more looking to be ported over, the task of keeping track was Herculean. Fortunately, this was reversed and now gods can only deal either physical or magical again. Even better still, strength and intelligence were untouched. Not only can you still build anything on anyone, about a third of the cast retain their kits that scale off both stats. Some abilities even scale off of protections now, which admittedly I'm not all that enthused about, but that is a discussion for later. In a move no one could have expected, Smite 2 took Consumables out back and gave them the old Yeller treatment. I believe the reasoning cited was that having consumable slots in addition to active item slots and relic slots made it difficult to map to a controller. I might be wrong. Luckily this was only temporary, with max actives being decreased in favor of bringing back dedicated consumables. The outcome of this change meant that wards were no longer limited to but 1 available on a 60-second cooldown, health chalice was brought back into existence, and potions could effectively be utilized at any stage in the game. As someone who spent the last 4 months complaining about vision restrictions, this made me happier than a pig in slop. And I'll be interested to see if they add new consumables down the line now that they are approachable again. The last change that left a lasting impression was the massive dead drop of Smite 1 items into the fray. Previously, there were only a few in Smite 2 that carried over from its predecessor, most of which were renamed entirely. This made it rather difficult for returning players starting out, as there was very little familiar ground to pull from. On one hand, the fun of discovery was at the forefront, on the other hand, creating a cohesive build every match consisting of 6 indistinct items proved overwhelming. So with the inclusion of Rod of Tahuti, Heartseeker, Gauntlet of Thebes, Prophetic Cloak, and Crusher among other things, there's always something to default to if you ever feel the need. Additionally, starter items made their way over, alongside a dedicated 7th item slot to accommodate them. This has greatly improved the early game experience for roles across the board, especially for support which found itself struggling with its reduced gold acquisition. So if I were to summarize all the above in a sentence, Smite 1 is back on the menu, and we didn't sacrifice Smite 2 to get there. As far as I'm concerned, that's a win for everyone. I'm interested to see if Hi-Rez can continue to push the boundaries of what the game can be. After all, this is still a sequel. That being said, it's nice to see crucial elements of the first game make their return, because the game felt vacant without them. I was going to double the size of this video and address things I'd like to see changed before 1.0, but given that I'm already 2 weeks late on releasing this, and deathly tired, that will have to be its own subject matter down the line. Thank you for watching, until next time.